Okay, today we're going to move on to the Baroque period, and Baroque actually, Barocco means a strangely shaped pearl. Nice pearls are nice and round, but there are other shapes. There are sort of ovular shapes, but the Baroque is a twisted, strange one. And it was called, this art was called that at first disparagingly. And then now it's just come to signify not only the art of this period, the 1600s, 1700s, but also the music of the period. Later on, of course, Bach and Handel and those great masters of the Baroque. The very first Baroque artist, however, is Italian, and the center of the art world is still very much Rome, as it had been in the Renaissance and its aftermath. And Caravaggio is really the quintessential very beginning of the Baroque. And within him are the seeds of the entire international Baroque that unfolds over the following century and a half. And so we're going to look at Caravaggio. However, he dies in 1610. And so the period, he just begins the Baroque and then dies tragically young. He has a very dramatic life. Unlike any of the other artists of the Renaissance, the Mannerist period that we have looked at in the past, Caravaggio, we find out most biographical detail, not from any art historians or anything like that, but from the police record and the court records, because Caravaggio was very often in touch with the law. That he was arrested several times. He spent some time in jail. He murdered at least one man, possibly more. Was accused also of rape. And so he was basically a sociopathic person who nonetheless was, I think, arguably one of the very greatest Christian artists of all time. And that's the real paradox of Caravaggio, is how he could lead such a strange, dissipated life and yet do such really substantial and sincere religious work. And so he's a man who is a paradox. This, by the way, one of my favorite pieces by him is painted on a shield. It's painted on leather. It's a wooden shield. And he did during the short stay he had with the knights. And we'll talk about that later. The severed head of Medusa. It was never really used in battle. It was a ceremonial shield. What we find, and that last lecture we looked at Mannerism, and we found out that in the 1500s, Mannerism had engendered all sorts of strange distortions, breaking of the rules, all sorts of strangeness. And a lot of it had to do with the workshop system, because each artists weren't educated in universities, they weren't educated in art schools or academies, they were in the individual workshops of individual maestros. And this had been a tradition that goes back, as you know, into the Renaissance. But what had happened during the 1500s is that each generation had gotten a little weirder than the one before. So that you have someone like Tintoretto, who really does some distortions, and then his student El Greco, who does even more distortions. And so we find it going in many, many different directions. And what we find in 1600 is a hard response to that, and coming out of Caravaggio's naturalism. So instead of the Mannerist distortion, like in this Parmigianino painting of the conversion of St. Paul, instead we have Caravaggio's naturalism, as in his painting of the very same subject matter. But now with the real gravitas and down to earth, almost gritty realism. And we'll explore these aspects of them later. The name of the artist was Michelangelo Merisi. He was born in the small town of Caravaggio that is near Milan in northern Italy. His parents fled Milan because there was an outbreak of the plague. And he was born in 1571. And he seems to have trained with an artist there who had trained with Titian, but he learns, he goes way beyond his master, way right from the very, very beginning. He visits Venice, absorbs all the manners of that. And by the time he's 21, he's hit Rome, and he realized that Rome is really the very center of the art world with nothing, right? A complete pauper, starving artist. And he does get employment in the studio of, in the large, very, very large factory-like workshop of an artist named Cesare, and he does still lifes. So this is an example of one of his beautiful still lifes that we still have from this very early period in his early 20s. And these very large studios would sometimes employ artists, not just journeymen and not just apprentices or anything, but low-paid artists to do the scenery in the background, do the little landscape, to do the clothing, to do the fruit dish and the Last Supper or whatever. And so he was employed sporadically with this kind of work. And we do see in a still life like this, his wonderful sense of naturalism, his ability to capture the exact species of each of the fruits and leaves that he displays. But notice also that he shows decay. The apple in the very, very center here has a very prominent wormhole. Also, the leaves here seems to have been, infested with aphids or some sort of plant destroying parasite. And so even in such a beautiful and realistic still life, he brings in these naturalistic details that would have been seen as unidealized and sort of raw in his work. He really gained some notoriety when he did a couple of paintings that were bought by the Cardinal Del Monte, who was his first major patron. And Del Monte bought, for example, this one, and it's a gypsy reading the poems of a young, looks like a nobleman, rich Italian nobleman or wealthy merchant class young man, very young man. And she, as she's reading his palm and she's eyeing him, she's also removing the ring from his finger, as you can see in this detail. It's sort of a genre piece. And it was thought of as and there's still gypsies in Rome. And so, anybody that kind of realize, even today, we can kind of relate to this thing and the arrogance of the young man and his well-dressed manners and his trusting and her very, suspicious. She's keeping eye contact with him while she's doing this, and she keeps talking all the time to keep him distracted. And he'll be halfway down the next street before he realizes that she's divested him of his ring. By the way, he's armed. He has a sword. Caravaggio was arrested a couple of times for being armed without a license. And he was in a lot of duels, a lot of fights. He drank far too much. Here's another painting. And he's only 21. And this is called the Card Sharps. And this is, he never really had any students. He never had a studio or anything like that. He had sort of followers and imitators. And one of the early ones is Mario Marini. And Marini serves as a model in a lot of his early work. And here, Marini is both this one and this one. And this is the young rich gentleman. And these two guys are in it together. And you can see the young man here has, is picking a card out of his back pocket. There's an arrow there. You see how he has the cards there in his back pocket, I guess. And he's pulling them out while he's trying to keep the eye contact. Meanwhile, his buddy, is looking right over his shoulder and with these gloves that have holes in the fingers to show that he's not really as rich as he pretends to be. He's an impoverished, shyster. And here these two guys are really taking this young rich man for all he's worth. And this became an incredibly popular painting. He was only in his early 20s. It became a very popular painting. And we have over 50 copies by Caravaggio, by just kind of his followers. He was a very flamboyant guy, and he kind of attracted camaraderie rough kind of guys. So this was also the basis of a lot of later Dutch genre depictions of everyday life. Yeah, this is great. Now, among the subjects that he did for Cardinal del Monte are these sort of homoerotic images, this one being, I think, the best one. And it kind of looks a little bit like Caravaggio himself. So I wouldn't be surprised if he's doing this in front of a mirror. This is Bacchus, who is the ancient Roman god of wine. And he very seductively, hands over this glass of wine to us while he makes direct eye contact with us. And this was kind of a very shocking painting of the time because of it, how it kind of broke the fourth wall, how the frame of the picture became almost like a window, and this guy was like reaching across the frame to offer us, a glass of wine. And it's, it's a very kind of a strange painting. If we go to the fruit, we see once again, as in that earlier fruit dish that was just a still life, that like this, I think it's a peach here, it's really rotten. And there's looks like a hole in the apple here. This also looks like it's been bruised. So this still life is not the freshest. And you would think that a god would have, only the very freshest. Also, if you look very carefully, and these are very small, realistic details, but people at the time noticed it too. This hand, both the hands are slightly sunburned, and so is the face. And you can see it a little bit in this picture, but in the painting, you really do notice it. And it's almost as if the model, he always used models. He didn't work from his imagination, he always used models. Almost if he had some working class model that was a little sunburned in that way. Also notice that his fingernails are dirty. Some of his fingernails are kind of dirty, as if he's been working outside almost. Whereas other aspects of him, as he kind of clasps this little bow or this little sash of his. And, it has this almost geisha-like seductiveness to it. And it's interesting too that the model and the face you see is a little ruddy as well. So it's like, is this the god of wine, who lives in a Mount Olympus or wherever it is? Or is this like a kid that he found on the street and dressed up with weird stuff in his hair and, used as a model? So he really breaks down not only that wall between our reality and the reality of the model, but even breaks down the whole thing of, is this a god or is this just a person dressed up? So it calls to mind all these different kind of levels of reality and metaphor. Also, he's wearing makeup. The model is wearing makeup. And Italian men do not wear makeup, except maybe male prostitutes. And so this has that whole brothel dimension to it that we might easily miss today, but maybe not. It's pretty openly, seductive. And how I like to think of it, and there's something I don't know how to say it without, there's something perversely seductive. And I don't mean the homosexuality of it. I mean the wine, the thing of like, try some. This won't hurt you. Why not have another glass? It's almost like, if we think of it, conceive of it in our modern terms, of the disease of alcoholism, right? Of someone who just can't resist taking that second or the third drink or whatever. And it's like, this is if you conceive of it as, instead of an allegory of an ancient god of wine, if this is a personification, let's say, of the disease of alcoholism, and how sort of seductive it is, and how, besides he has these ruddy complexion, he also has a very soft and kind of, not in a good way, in a sort of undeveloped sort of way, a baby fat sort of way. So it's like this, and he's almost, I'm almost taunting us, like, what's the matter? Won't your mommy let you? You kind of thing. So it has this weird seductive quality that makes it, I think, a very enticing piece as a representation of the vice of alcohol. And that's how they thought of it. They did not think of it as a disease or a disorder or anything like that. They thought of it as a vice, and that anybody could get into it, but it was a vice, and it would, and you know. And I should also mention, this is an interesting aspect of Italian culture, is that to be openly drunken, to be that you can see the effects of alcohol is considered to be unmanly in Italian culture. And I've been to Italy a lot, I've never seen a drunken Italian. I've seen drunken Americans in my German staying around, but I really never have. And it's a very shameful thing. And of course, for women too, it's unladylike as well as being unmanly. And so the whole way that he uses the way not only that he overindulged himself in such things, but his personification of the temptation and the kind of perverseness of it, the irrationality, the viceness of it, the sinfulness, if you will, of it all. And he's really flirting with this sin, and not as a moralistic teetotaler, but as someone who likes to drink. So it's a very beguiling and disturbing and seductive and beautiful and horrible painting all at once, and he's very young, This is another one of his paintings in this period. And this shows his wonderful ability to capture deep spirituality in, I think, a very sincere way. And here he uses again Mario Minetti, and this time very idealized and very, very muscularized. He has this huge football player frame with a very soft face, almost feminine face, androgynous face. And this is the angel that holds up the swooning St. Francis of Assisi. And St. Francis of Assisi, of course, the patron of Saint of Italy. And he had visions of the angels and so forth. And one of the visions, his hands began to bleed and so forth, according to the stories about the life of this saint. And he was a very popular, and remains a very, very popular Christian saint. But here Caravaggio shows us his own face as the face of St. Francis, having swooned and just literally fainted back in the arms of Mario. And here, if you could see it, I've seen the painting, it's not all that large. It's maybe a meter, a foot and a half wide. And but the eyes, I don't know if you can see it here, the eyes of St. Francis have rolled back into his head, like someone who's having an epileptic seizure. And it's very tender, and it's very beautiful, and it's very pure. And in the background, it's hard to see, but the sun has just set, and there's some coals and a little fire that I guess he's lit. He's I guess in the wilderness praying, and has had an ecstatic vision, and then sinks back into the arms of this magnificent, powerful, but so gentle angel. How he idealizes is incredible. Here's another, this is the sacrifice of Isaac. You're probably familiar with the story in the Hebrew Bible of the book of Genesis, of Abraham, who had no children, and yet miraculously his wife bore a child to him when they were very advanced in age, way beyond the age when women can bear children. This was a miraculous child. And then, of course, God, testing him, asked him to sacrifice his son. And when he was 12 or 13 years old, and to test Abraham. And so Abraham decides that everything comes from God. Who knows why he would ask me to do this, but he does it. And he takes the son to the top of the mountain, and the son, I suppose, thinks that they're going to sacrifice an animal there or something, he doesn't realize that he's going to be murdered by his father. And so Abraham is actually going to go through with it, proving that he will do whatever God says, even if it doesn't make sense to him, even if it goes against all his deepest instincts. And so but here the angel at the last moment, he has the knife out, he has the boy down on a rock, the incredibly impassioned face. This is another of his models, Checo. He's in a lot of the paintings. He was maybe an apprentice, but here, he does it beautifully. He has the knife in his hand. He's about to sacrifice his son when the angel, who also was modeled by Checo, looks just exactly like Isaac, stops his hand and points to the ram that we see highlighted to the right of Isaac's head, and he says that's and then he sacrificed the ram. And he has proven, therefore, that he's willing to do whatever God says and to trust him unequivocally. It's also said to be symbolic of the end of human sacrifice in religion. That God doesn't want human sacrifice. That's later interpretation. I heard the story of Isaac and Abraham is read at Yom Kippur, and there was a rabbi who gave he said that actually failed the test, and he should have argued with God. And later he does that when it comes to Sodom and Gomorrah. He asks if there's 50 good men and so forth, so that he should have bargained with God. And he got in a lot of trouble for that sermon, but it was great. Anyway, he really captures the drama of the moment. And this is a good place to bring in, I suppose, this new art form that's all the rage in Rome and will take off in Italy, and that is opera. The first operas by Claudio Monteverdi. We still have versions of these, and they're still sometimes performed, these Baroque operas. They began right around 1600s. So just around the time that Caravaggio is hitting his stride and he's in Rome, this fantastic new art form takes off that combines drama and lighting and costumes and music and an orchestra and the whole thing, right? And it's all very, very emotional, right? It's an art form of the heart. And still in Italy, every little town has its own opera company. And people, they argue about divas and about arias the way we talk about baseball. It's truly a popular art. And from the very first moment it hit, everybody loved it. And that sense of drama and that sense of operatic stagecraft that he uses is an important aspect of the Baroque that he continues. Here's another very strange kind of painting, also of Checo, of this model, when he's a little younger. Very sort of strangely, disturbingly erotic painting. Music, the arrows, he's laughter. His posture also echoes a Michelangelo, a figure of victory that we looked at in an earlier lecture. But there it's this, this Michelangelo-esque figure dominating an older man, and it's a symbol of victory. But here, Checo is in the same thing. There's no person that he's dominating here, but he's in exactly that same position. But instead of a heroic, victorious, victor, he's this, playful boy who's like laughing, and it's very strange. Okay, 3 stylistic innovations of Caravaggio that will be followed up on by later artists a great deal. First, and we've talked about this a little bit in relationship to the Bacchus, the breakdown of the fourth wall. That's a term from theater. You think of one of those box sets where there's a background and there's like a room and it's just a little box, but the fourth wall is invisible, and that's the promesium. That's what we see it through. It's the rectangle we see. Proscenium, So there's a breakdown of the fourth wall that we saw already in the Bacchus, right? He looks right, reaches right across the frame with that wine. This doesn't look that new to us because we've seen a lot of things where this happens in photos and everything else. But at that time, it was shockingly realistic that he actually just hands it right across the picture frame. And we can almost just pick it right up and take it. Now, in this painting of, and we looked a little bit earlier, the conversion of St. Paul. St. Paul, let me just tell you briefly the story. St. Paul was different than all the other apostles and disciples of Jesus because he never met Jesus during Jesus's life. He had a vision of Jesus after Jesus's death and resurrection. So it's mentioned in the book of Acts. And so he is at first persecutes Christians because he is a Pharisee and he believes it's a heresy against the Jewish faith. And as he's riding his on the road to Damascus to persecute some more Christians, he's struck by a great light, thrown off his horse, has a vision of Christ, who says, "Why do you persecute me?" And then he has a conversion, and he changes from enemy of the Christians to super Christian, right? And he founds all these churches in Corinth and Greece, and ends up in Rome and martyrs in Rome and so forth, and writes more than half of the New Testament, it seems to me, all these epistles and so forth by Paul. So Paul's a very important proselytizer of the Christian message, yet he never meets Jesus except just in his vision. Okay, so this is the moment that he's thrown off his horse. He's thrown right into our space. This is an altarpiece, so the altar is right underneath it. It's life-size, the horse is big. He's thrown right off and slides almost into our space with a very daring perspective and a very daring lighting that looks operatic. Now, let me just compare it to a high Renaissance painting of about 100 years earlier, 90, 100 years earlier. This is actually a cartoon for a tapestry by Raphael, and it's the same subject matter. This is Paul. He's been knocked off his horse. These are his buddies. They don't see the vision. Here, Raphael actually puts Christ in the middle of the painting. But notice how idealized, Paul is. He's Michelangelo-esque kind of physique. How none of these kids have dirty feet. They're running around barefoot. It has this triangular composition like that, right? That stabilizes it. We see this a lot in Raphael, right? So this is all review, right? So balance, harmony, order, none of them are aware of us. The fourth wall is intact. They don't see us the way that Bacchus sees us. Here, it bursts right into our own space, right into our own space. So that breakdown of space is radical and new, and it's shocking, right? Okay, so there's that breakdown of the fourth wall. Then there's the drama of the whole thing that's influenced by opera. It looks like it's staged. It's looked like it's professionally lit. So it has that drama, that sense of theatricality, that sense of Paul could almost be seen a high A or something as he falls before Jesus. And he doesn't show Jesus. We just see the light. We just see Paul's, and we don't see any of his companions except for the groom of the horse. Okay, so we have this breakdown of space. We have a drama, real theatricality influenced by opera. And then finally, we have this naturalism or this realism. And by that, I mean showing unidealized details, like of this kind of homely groom of the horse. And if you look carefully, you'll see that he has varicose veins in his legs. These are not an ideal Adonis, right? Also, he has dirty feet. He has dirt on his toes. He has dirty toenails, right? So this is an unidealized naturalism that looks, honest to God, real, right? And part of it is the daring perspective, but also think of how he doesn't emphasize the heroic qualities of the horse. Horses are so beautiful, and they're such a traditional a subject matter. And here he literally shows us the horse's ass, right? You can't think of a less heroic posture for the horse. And this is his kind of radical naturalism that some people saw as very, very vulgar. You know, they said, you know, the Mannerists brought us all these weird looking stuff, and now we're showing just raw data. But yet people liked it. It drew crowds. It had a sense of drama. It reminded them of the opera. When they went to mass and they heard the music and they saw the drama of the liturgy, it all kind of came together and was a persuasive sort of thing for, let's say, a German merchant that might be visiting Rome on business and might wander into a Catholic church and be so blown away by the beauty of the music and the art and the liturgy and the smells and so forth, that he thinks this must be the true church, and turns from his Lutheran ways to embrace Catholicism. And this was really an important propaganda mission of the church at this time, because remember, half of Northern Europe, England, parts of France, the Netherlands, Northern Germany, Switzerland, these were all Protestant lands now. So there was an ideological war and a propaganda war on the part of the Catholic Church. Give us drama, give us things that will convince people that this is the true church and that they should come back, right? So it had this kind of mission. And Caravaggio, as unlikely a candidate for holiness or sainthood as he is the unlikely forerunner of all of it. Okay. Now, in this same chapel, he also, it was about the life of St. Matthew. We're not going to look at all of them, we're going to look at a couple of them. But there was also one that was supposed to be St. Matthew being inspired to write his gospel, the Gospel of Matthew, the first book of the New Testament. And there he is shown, and there's Checo as an angel, just kind of, you know, here, guiding his hand. And look at what a clumsy looking old coot he is. He looks like a peasant. He looks like he barely knows how to read. And then also the way he sits on the chair, the way he crosses his legs kind of strangely, and how the one leg kind of comes out at us through that fourth wall, right? That had a strangeness and a clumsiness that the church just said, we won't accept this. This is not, you know, we like the conversion of St. Paul, but we're not going to go along with this this version of Matthew. And so he redid it. Then he did it this way. And this one they did accept. This is actually a different chapter. I'm sorry. But this is the older piece of a different chapter. And they're all in Rome. And they're all, you just walk into the church when you know it's open and you can go to them. We're all perfectly free. You know, so that's a good thing about Rome. It's not true in Siena, Florence anymore. So in this one, he shows, you know, it's more conventional. It's less of a breakdown of the wall. He's less clumsy. He's more, and he looks up as Checo kind of comes down, making points as preachers used to do. I guess during sermons, they would use, you know, the first point, the second point of the sermon, the third point. So he's kind of doing that, almost dictating to the saint. But Caravaggio had to get his rebelliousness in here, his irrepressible, you know, irreverence. And so he shows the stool on which the saint is kneeling to be off the edge. You see how that is? There's a ledge and one foot of the stool is off the ledge. And so he could just topple into our space at any time. We look kind of up at him, right? So it was much more conventional, and it's a beautiful painting. The other one was too, but it's just a little too naturalistic, a little too crude, a little too much like an uneducated, you know, Galilean peasant, and not enough like, you know, a lofty saint. Here is, and we'll come back to that St. Matthew series. Here's another painting. This is very impressive. This is in the Vatican now. The figures are life-size, and I think particularly moving. And you can't really get into reproduction, but when you're there, you'll see what I mean. It has an incredible sense of presence, especially this figure in the front. It's Joseph of Arimathea, and his elbow comes out at us, and his face looks right. He's got, sunburned, wrinkled face looks right at us with an accusatory look, like you did this. Your sins caused his death. Kind of it's a very accusatory sort of painting. And the realism of that, and you can see the dirty toenails of Jesus, although mostly Jesus is idealized. And then up there, St. Mary Magdalene looks like a soprano who's hitting her high note at the apex of this diagonal sweep that goes through the painting. This is often a trademark of or a characteristic, stylistic characteristic of the Baroque, as opposed to the Renaissance, is the diagonal axis. Instead of it being balanced, it's a diagonal. And so it gives it a sense of sweep and drama. And this, once again, is, and then also how that slab on the bottom comes out at us. I can't emphasize how much in the real painting, how it's startlingly present. It's really incredible in that sense. Here's another painting from the Matthew series, and this is really is one of his most really made him a star. And it's in the French church. A French church in Rome is still there. It's very large, 10-foot square. It's a little wider than it's tall, and it's the calling of Saint Matthew. And St. Matthew, was a bad guy. It's like Paul was a bad guy, and then he turned into a guy. Matthew was a tax collector. You may think, well, that's reasonable. It's not, because in first century Judea, the tax collectors collected tax for the Romans who were occupying it. So it would be like, being in Nazi-occupied France and working for the Nazis to get money. And they often used extortion and all sorts of pressuring. And they found out if they had Romans collect the tax, people would kill the Romans. So they got unscrupulous Jews to do it. So this is really not just a tax collector, this is a collaborator with the Romans. This is a guy who is not by any stretch of the imagination holy or good or righteous or anything. He's a real slime. And yet Jesus says, I want you. And chooses him. Here, he sort of emerges from the shadows in this way with his diagonal, almost like a cellar light, almost like they're in a cellar. And his hand gestures, while Peter, we think this is Peter, the apostle, is pointing as well. Jesus seems to have selected Matthew. Matthew, surprised, like, Rabbi, you must have the wrong guy, because, I'm a shyster. And the two people to his left, the kid and the old man, they're so absorbed in counting the money that they don't even notice Jesus. And Matthew, but yet Matthew, according to, he has a change of heart right there. He gets up, he leaves it all behind, he leaves everything behind and follows Jesus. And eventually, goes on to martyrdom and so forth. So he's become, and writes the gospel, first, the Gospel of Matthew. And so he turns from a bad guy to a good guy. And again, it's that Counter-Reformation theme of come back to Mother Church. Very convincingly done, almost staged as if it's an opera, and we're seeing that. Also, he heightens the naturalism of it, not by having dirty toenails and stuff like that, but by having young men in contemporary dress. And I heard a very interesting lecture at a conference 10, 12 years ago at CAA, I don't remember, but she was looking at the colors and so forth. These are like gang members. And people at the time would recognize these hooligans. And especially this kid here is very defiant. He's looking like, yes, kind of very brazen. And the cocky angle of their thing. So these are These are bad guys. These are gang members. These are hooligans. And it brought it to life because here, these are the kind of armed hooligans that you might see in the square, making trouble, drinking too much, chasing after girls, things like that, right? And here, Jesus. Now, notice also he's quoting, he knows his art history, and he's quoting from his namesake, Michelangelo Buonarroti, because that hand of Jesus is the mirror of the hand of Adam in the Sistine Chapel ceiling, the creation of Adam by Michelangelo Buonarroti from the century before, the High Renaissance arts. So it's almost like Jesus is the new Adam. And just as God's hand kind of gives life to Adam, so Jesus's calling of Matthew invigorates him. And you can even see his legs, even here. He's getting ready to stand up. He's getting ready to follow Jesus without question and leave all of it behind, right? Well, this is a very, very interesting painting in many ways because it encapsulates Caravaggio's rambunctious life. Let me give you a few examples of a thing. He, for example, he was in several duels and became, and was arrested a few times for not having a license to carry his sword. He liked to brandish a sword. He drank too much, which was seen as unmanly. He was involved. There was a man who got a commission that he wanted, and he started spreading these rumors about him. And then he himself was accused of libel, and another and was accused of sodomy. The model that they describe as a bardassa, which is I guess a male prostitute, or something. Unclear what it is, but apparently he and Miniti had some sort of illicit sexual relations with this kid, and he was accused of that, although the case was dropped. So, he has this real criminal background. He also got sued by a waiter. He didn't like the food, and he threw it in the waiter's face, burning him, and really like outrageous behavior, starting fights. He would paint very rapidly. He starts with a dark ground and brings lights out of the dark ground. No one does that. Maybe Tintoretto a little bit before him, but he drags the brush across the surface of the painting. So it has a very rough character to it that goes along with the ruffians that he paints and the ruffians that he hangs around with. Well, kind of the culmination of it in Rome for him was when he murdered a man after a tennis game. And they got into an argument about the rules or something, and there might have been more to it. There might have been a woman involved, according to some people. But anyway, he murders the guy. And the guy was from a well-to-do family. And so the Pope gave orders to execute Caravaggio. And so with this order, it meant that anybody that could find him could behead him. And that wouldn't be illegal because he was doing, the Pope's will. So the Pope put literally a price on his head. And Caravaggio fled Rome and was in exile and went to Naples. Now, Naples at that time was part of the Kingdom of Spain. Remember, there's no Italy. So the Papal States in the south of the Kingdom of Naples, ruled by Spain, and to the north, Milan and other city-states. Okay, so the police and the armies of the Pope had no jurisdiction beyond the Papal States. So when he fled to Naples in the south, he was free. And so he stayed there a while and had an enormous influence on Spanish art. All these Caravaggisti rose up looking at his work. None of them really his pupils. He was too dissipated. But there were a lot of admirers, and it really kind of went to his head. Well, he couldn't return to Rome, but he continued to have a lot of commissions, and including for church pieces. One of my favorites is this one, the Madonna of Loretto, which is now in Rome. what was originally commissioned for Loretto, which is in central Italy, north of Rome. And they have the House of Mary. Supposedly, Mary's little peasant house from Nazareth flew through the air and then came into Loretto. And so that was the holy shrine of this little hut that they have there that is said to have flown. And so they had to paint the Madonna of Loretto. And a lot of people said they should have called it the Whore of Loretto because he used a notorious prostitute as his model and her 3-year-old son, illegitimate son. And they were horrified by it, but people loved the painting nonetheless. Now, one of the things that was outrageous, and here are these peasant pilgrims that have come to ask favors of the Madonna and of Jesus. They've wandered a long time. They have those pilgrim staffs. They have bare feet, and the bare feet are dirty, right? And this is an altarpiece, right? So there's an altar right under there. So there is a priest standing in front of the smaller than life size figures, but there's right by the bread and the wine down there on the holy altar is these dirty peasant feet. And so some people thought this was too realistic. This was too naturalistic. This was going against everything the Renaissance had done. Not in the weird way of Mannerism, but from a radically realistic sort of view. And how he was able to transform this prostitute into a Madonna is really incredible. And it has an incredible sense of compassion and listening. Really listens. And Madonna really listens. And Jesus is sort of blessing the pilgrims as they come. It's a very moving, very sincere, very real painting, you know? So this is so strange. How could Michelangelo, you see, just as Matthew was a brigand that was chosen by Christ and rose to the occasion, so it would seem that Caravaggio, a villain and in his own way, rises to this level. This is another painting he did, this now at the Louvre, very large, 15 feet tall, something like that, The Death of the Virgin. And here again, it was said that he used a corpse of a woman that had drowned in the river, a homeless woman or something. And you've gone to the morgue, and the way her feet kind of hang off of the bed, it was seen as just there's this bloated corpse of this woman, and it's not, really proper for the death of the Virgin. And the Catholics believe the Virgin rose to heaven, so they said there's no indication of even an afterlife for her here at all. In some versions of the death of the Virgin, Jesus is receiving her soul into heaven, but here she's just dead. And some people saw this as blasphemous. Okay, so from Naples, he went to Sicily for a while, and then he wanted to go to Malta, the island of Malta, where the Knights of Malta were. The Knights of Malta, at one time during the Crusades, during the Middle Ages, hundreds of years before, had led into the Holy Land and all that sort of stuff. Now it was a very, very classy, elitist men's club, a confraternity. And only the very highest class people from an aristocratic class and who had done good deeds and were on good terms with the church and so forth were allowed into the confraternity as a member. And Caravaggio wanted to be a member of this club, and it's difficult because he had murdered people, he's been banished with a price on his head from the Pope. Bring me Caravaggio, dead or alive. And so they do accept him. And they lionize him at first, because here they have this wonderful, famous artist living among them, and he does this shield for them as a trophy, kind of, as they hung in the clubhouse. And it's now in Florence, it's the Uffizi, and it's a round piece of wood, and there's leather attached to it, and then the Medusa's head is painted on. I can't help thinking of them saying that they to behead Caravaggio. I think this was going on in his mind. Of course, this is from the ancient Greek myth of Perseus, who pursues Medusa, who has snakes as hair, and if you look at her, you turn into stone. And so she had all these statues, stone statues, and Perseus used a mirror and beheaded her, and here she is beheaded, just the head, just the severed head on this shield. looking like, you know, a soprano singing her high C in the middle of a very dramatic scene. You know, this melodrama, this sense of, you know, theater, this flamboyance. This is very much part of it. But before long, he had messed up there as well, and insulted some people, drank too much, and was thrown in jail, escaped from jail, and then had the Knights of Malta after him for some scandals that he had started there. So now he had the family of the wealthy man that he had killed in Rome after him. He also had other people that didn't like him from years past. He had a lot of people that had old grudges against him. A new pope got in. He wanted to get a pardon from the pope so that he could return to Rome. And he began on a boat trip. And he disembarked at some point and was arrested because he was in papal territory. And then he was detained and then tried to catch up with a boat that had all his stuff in it. And he died of a fever. But some said that he had been murdered, poisoned. There are a lot of things. One of his last, here's some of his last paintings, a very large painting that he did in Malta of the beheading of St. John the Baptist. And you can see here in his late work, he limits his palette to almost monochrome, almost just brown and white. The spotlight and the executioner here, very large, out of proportion large. He holds the head of John, he has the knife in his hand. This lackey says, you know, that's where you put it in this dish. This is going to be taken to Salome as soon as the dastardly deed is done. And he shows it, you know, with this great drama. The only real touch of color is that red robe of the martyred Baptist. It's an incredible tour de force. And I like especially how he uses negative space in such an amazing way. You know, he's only really in his mid-30s when his life came to an end. Among his very last paintings is this strange painting of David with the severed head of Goliath. And once again, we have this breakdown of space where, you know, David shoves the head of Goliath right over that, through the picture frame at us, like, look at this. He also has an interesting expression that mixed a sort of disgust, like, with also a note of compassion, a note of compassion. Do you see that also in his face? It's like, oh, you know, it didn't have to be like this. There's this sense of that a little bit. Now, the interesting thing is, that's Caravaggio's head. He and his rotten teeth, and he's, you know, he drank far too much. So even though he's only 36, he looks, you know, past that age, and his eyes have lost focus. He's decapitated, but you almost feel there's a little bit of life left of him, that last 30 seconds. And it's shoved into our space with such incredible force, and it has such a grossness to it, the bleeding and dripping. It's a really horrible thing. So, you know, it's interesting. He kind of realized that he was a monster in some ways, and in this self-portrait, I think, sees himself as it's a very strange, it's a very strange and very moving end to a strange career. Influence of Caravaggio, although he had no students, had no workshop or anything like that, a whole generation or two were very influenced by him, especially the people called the Tenebrists. And tenebrae means shadows, and they were artists who used shadows like Caravaggio does with his raking light. And so Orazio Gentileschi, for example, this the Rest on the Flight to Egypt. It's a little more toned down, but it has that quality of extreme light and dark and a sort of drama. And this is a diagonal sweep that goes through it, echoed both in the angel, but also in the organ and the saints' gestures below against this black background. is Guido Reni. Again, these are all the next generation. Now, Caravaggio, in this painting like this, it has a sadistic quality. The faces of the tormentors of Jesus is being tied up and whipped prior to his death. And he really captures this monstrous sadistic quality and it's picked up by Spanish artists like Jose Ribera or Giuseppe Ribera, he's called in Italy. He was one of those artists from Naples that took the tradition back to Spain. And this is Prometheus, who, as you know, gave light to man and was punished by having a vulture tear out his liver. And then it heals over every day. And he's just perpetually in this torturous realm. And that drama and that sense of psychological horror is a big part of it. And my favorite of the Spaniards is Francisco Zurbarán, who has an amazing sort of light that is just transfigures on his figures. It's very raking light and dark. This is in Chicago Art Institute, one of my very favorite paintings. Also very influential on Salvador Dali in the 20th century, the Surrealists by Zurbarán. And perhaps most colorfully, Artemisia Gentileschi. We looked at Orazio Gentileschi as a Caravaggisti or a Tenebrist. And his daughter, Artemisia, also took this up. And this is unusual because women could not train. There was no mechanism. They couldn't be apprentices. So she learned from her father. And so she did these things. It's interesting that she gets no commissions because she's not a verified artist. So she does whatever she wants to. And she paints over and over the scene of Judith and Holofernes. Judith, a Hebrew, goes into the camp of the Philistines and seduces Holofernes and beheads him. And then here the maid is stuffing the head in a bag. And here Judith, now it's her face. She shows herself as Judith. And Caravaggio did it, look at this, it's incredible. It did it before, but and here she does another version. Once again, it's her face as it. And it came out in the 80s. Feminist art historians looking back at some of the court records found out that she was actually, she was the victim of a rape. She was raped by a drawing teacher that her father had hired. And then there was a court proceedings that went. And so her work has been interpreted as a sort of feminist rage in the wake of this violation. It's intense. Tenebrism even spreads to Northern Europe. We'll look at Georges de Latour, for example, in France, this wonderful painting of the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian, lit by this candlelight. And most apropos to our next lecture, where we're going to move to the Netherlands. And we'll see here, like these are Flemish painters, that light and dark, that chiaroscuro, that realism, and of course Rembrandt, the master of light. Here, a rabbi in his study, shielding that candle. Where would he be without the example of Caravaggio from the beginning of the century? So Caravaggio lays the groundwork for the whole next century. And we're not going to have enough time in our short series to look at France and England and all these others, but we are going to look at the Netherlands and Flanders and which was Protestant, and to see how they spun the naturalism of it. So in our next lecture, we're going to move to the High Baroque of Gian Lorenzo Bernini, who not only incorporated painting, but also sculpture, architecture, town planning into these magnificent sculptural ensembles that are truly opera in a visual form. If you want to find out more about what I'm doing here and other places, check out my website, get a hold of me, and we'll, I guess this is a time where we can take questions.